The commercial flight was packed. A man in a faded shirt sat quietly in seat 14C, his young daughter tucked close beside him. A passenger behind him sneered, "Smells like sweat. Wrong section, buddy." The flight attendant frowned. "Sir, this seat is for priority guests." The man just smiled softly, pulling his daughter closer. He said nothing. Suddenly, the intercom crackled. A high-ranking officer stepped into the cabin. He stopped. His eyes locked on 14C. His hands began to tremble. Then he raised his hand in a sharp military salute. "Welcome back, Ghost Wolf." The entire cabin froze. Jack Hale was 38 years old. He looked like any other tired father. His shirt was wrinkled. His shoes were worn. His hands were rough from years of manual labor. But those hands had once held the lives of soldiers. They had dragged men through fire. They had pulled triggers that saved entire units. Now they just held his daughter. Ella was 9. She had bright eyes and a smile that made everything worth it. She believed her daddy was a superhero. She just didn't know how right she was. Jack kept a silver dog tag in his shirt pocket. It was faded, scratched. The name on it was not his real name. It said Ghost Wolf. That was another lifetime. Another man. Or so he told himself. The airport had been chaos. Jack bought the cheapest tickets he could find. Economy class. Middle seats. It didn't matter. He just needed to get Ella home. But when they boarded, something was wrong. Their seat numbers were different. The system had upgraded them. Seat 14C and 14D. Premium economy. Near the front, Jack didn't ask questions. He just took the seats. The cabin filled quickly. Business travelers, military officers in dress uniforms, corporate executives with expensive watches. Everyone looked important. Everyone looked like they belonged. Except Jack. He sat down quietly. Ella pressed against the window, excited to see the clouds. Jack buckled her in, smoothed her hair, whispered that everything would be okay. The man behind them noticed first. He was loud, overweight, wore a suit that cost more than Jack made in a month. "Look at his shoes," the man said to his companion. "Doesn't belong here." Jack heard it. He always heard it, but he didn't react. He never did. A woman across the aisle wrinkled her nose. "Did they just let anyone sit up here now?" Ella's smile faded. She looked up at her father. "Daddy, why are they being mean?" Jack touched her cheek gently. "Some people just have bad days, sweetheart. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Not to Ella. She could feel the stares and the judgment, the way people looked at her father like he was less than them. Jack pulled out a small bag of crackers, handed them to Ella. "Here, you must be hungry." She took them, but didn't eat. She just watched her daddy. The way he stayed calm, the way he didn't fight back. She wondered if that made him weak. She didn't know. She couldn't know. That staying calm in the face of cruelty was the hardest battle of all. The flight attendant approached. She was young, professional. Her smile was tight. "Sir, I need to verify your ticket." Jack handed it over without a word. She scanned it, frowned, scanned it again. "There must be a mistake," she said quietly. "This seat is usually reserved for priority guests." The businessman behind them laughed. "Told you." Jack just nodded. "I can move. It's fine." "No, Daddy," Ella whispered. "We don't have to." But Jack was already standing. He didn't want trouble. He never wanted trouble. He just wanted to get his daughter home. The businessman leaned forward. His breath smelled like whiskey. "This section is for people who matter." Laughter rippled through the nearby rows. Small, cruel, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting. Jack stood frozen in the aisle. Ella clutched his hand. Her fingers were trembling. "We can sit in the back." "Daddy," she whispered. "It's okay." It wasn't okay, but Jack nodded anyway. He picked up their small backpack, started to move toward the rear of the plane. The flight attendant looked relieved. "Thank you for understanding, sir." Understanding. That's what they called it when you swallowed your dignity. As Jack walked past the rows, he felt every eye on him. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stared openly, judging, measuring, finding him lacking. A woman in first class whispered to her husband, "Probably used someone else's miles." Another man smirked. "Or stole a credit card?" Jack kept walking, his jaw tight, his eyes forward. Ella pressed against his side. They reached row 27. 2 middle seats, cramped, next to a man who immediately looked annoyed at having neighbors. Jack helped Ella into her seat. She didn't look excited anymore. She looked small, hurt. "I'm sorry, baby," Jack said softly. "It's not your fault, Daddy." But her eyes said something different. They said maybe he should have fought back. Maybe he should have stood up for them. Jack sat down. The seat was uncomfortable. The man next to him shifted away, as if poverty was contagious. The plane's engines hummed. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Jack stared at the seat in front of him, at the faded fabric, the broken screen. This was his life now. This was what he had become. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest on board today. Please remain seated." The energy in the cabin shifted. People sat up straighter, adjusted their jackets. A military officer was boarding. Someone important. Jack didn't move. He'd seen enough officers, enough brass, enough men who wore their ranks like crowns. Heavy footsteps moved down the aisle, confident, commanding. The kind of walk that came from decades of authority. "General Parker on board," someone whispered. A 4-star general. People stood instinctively, nodded. Some saluted awkwardly, forgetting they were civilians. The general was tall, 60-something. His uniform was perfect. His chest covered in medals, ribbons, commendations. This was a man who had seen real war. He moved slowly down the aisle, shaking hands, nodding at officers, playing the role. Then he stopped. Row 14. His eyes locked on the empty seats. 14C and 14D. His face changed. The professional smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, scanning the cabin. Who was sitting here? His voice cut through the cabin like a blade. The flight attendant rushed over, nervous. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding. We relocated them to accommodate—" "Where?" The general's voice was ice. She pointed toward the back. "Row 27, sir." The general turned. His eyes swept the rows, scanning faces, searching. Then he found him. Jack sat perfectly still, his head down, hoping to be invisible, but the general saw him. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something else, something that looked like pain. The general started walking, not toward first class, not toward his assigned seat, toward the back of the plane, toward row 27. The entire cabin watched, confused, curious. What was happening? The general stopped at Jack's row, stood in the aisle, towering. Jack slowly looked up. Their eyes met. The general's hand moved, slowly, deliberately. He raised it to his brow, a perfect military salute. "Welcome back, Ghost Wolf." The cabin exploded into silence, the kind of silence that's louder than screams. Every head turned, every eye locked on Jack. The businessman who had mocked him went pale. The flight attendant's hand covered her mouth. The woman who had complained about his smell looked like she might be sick. Ella stared at her father. "Daddy!" Jack didn't move, didn't salute back. He just looked at the general with tired eyes. "That was a lifetime ago, sir." The general lowered his hand. His voice was thick with emotion. "You carried 6 of my men out of Fallujah, under heavy fire. You took 3 bullets. You refused to leave anyone behind." Jack's hand instinctively moved to his shoulder. where the scars still lived. "Just doing my job," Jack said quietly. "Your job?" The general's voice rose, not in anger, in disbelief. He turned to face the cabin, to face all of them. "This man saved more lives than any of you will ever know. He's received commendations from 3 presidents. He turned down a Medal of Honor because he said he didn't deserve it more than the men who didn't make it home." The businessman tried to sink into his seat. The flight attendant had tears streaming down her face. Ella tugged on Jack's sleeve. Her voice was tiny, awed. "Daddy, you're a hero?" Jack looked down at his daughter, smiled that same gentle smile. "I'm just your dad, sweetheart." The general didn't move. He stood in the aisle like a monument, his hands still raised in salute, waiting. Jack slowly stood. His knees creaked. His back ached. Years of construction work had taken their toll, but his posture changed, straightened. Something in his body remembered. He returned the salute. Sharp, perfect, military precision. The general's eyes glistened. "At ease, soldier." Jack lowered his hand, but he didn't sit. The entire plane was watching now. Every single person. The air was thick with tension. "Sir, you don't need to do this," Jack said quietly. "Don't need to?" The general's voice cracked. "Son, I've waited 15 years to thank you properly." He turned again to address the cabin. His voice carried to every row, first class to the very back. "October 2009, Fallujah. My convoy was ambushed. IED took out our lead vehicle. Insurgents had us pinned down from 3 directions. We lost communication. We were cut off, bleeding out." The cabin was dead silent. Even the engines seemed quieter. Command wrote us off, said extraction was impossible, too hot, too many hostiles. They told our families to prepare for the worst. A woman in business class had her hand over her mouth. An officer in uniform stood at attention in the aisle. "Then he came." The general pointed at Jack. "Ghost Wolf, that was his call sign. Nobody knew his real name. Nobody knew his face. He was a legend, a myth. The operator they sent when everyone else had given up." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, please." But the general wasn't stopping. He came alone, one man, against 40 insurgents. He moved through that city like smoke, took out their positions one by one. Then he reached us. The general's voice broke. He paused, swallowed hard. "I had 3 bullets in me. My sergeant had lost half his leg. My radio operator was unconscious. We had 6 men total, all wounded, all dying." Ella grabbed Jack's hand. She was staring at her father like she'd never seen him before. "He pulled us out, one by one, under fire. He took 3 rounds himself, right here." The general tapped his shoulder. "Here, his ribs. And here, his thigh." But he didn't stop. He carried my sergeant on his back, dragged me with one arm, covered us with the other. Someone in first class started clapping, then someone else. Then the entire plane erupted in applause. Jack closed his eyes. This was his nightmare. Not the bullets, not the blood. This, the attention, the hero worship, the impossible pedestal people put him on. The general raised his hand. The applause died. He got us to the extraction point, all 6 of us, alive. Then he disappeared, refused medical attention, refused commendation, refused everything, just vanished back into the shadows. The general's voice dropped. Intimate now, personal. "I spent years trying to find you, to thank you. They told me Ghost Wolf was retired, off the grid. They wouldn't give me your real name, classified, for your protection." Jack met his eyes. "I didn't do it for thanks, sir. I know. That's what makes it matter." The general stepped closer, lowered his voice so only Jack and Ella could hear. "Why are you sitting back here? Why did they move you? Jack glanced at Ella. Because I look like I don't belong. The general's jaw tightened. His eyes went hard. He turned to the flight attendant who had relocated them. She was crying now, shaking. You moved him? His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. I didn't know, sir. I just thought. You thought what? That a man in worn shoes doesn't deserve respect? That scars from serving this country make someone less than? She couldn't speak, just shook her head. The businessman who had mocked Jack tried to disappear into his seat, but the general saw him, walked over. You said this section was for people who matter. The man's face was red, sweating. I didn't mean. You did mean it. You meant every word. The general's voice carried again. Let me tell you something. This man matters more than every person in first class combined. He's got more courage in one finger than you've got in your entire body. The businessman said nothing. What could he say? The general returned to Jack. His voice softened. Come with me. Sir, it's really not necessary. It absolutely is. The general looked down at Ella, smiled gently. Young lady, would you and your father join me in first class? Those seats are empty, and I think it's time someone who actually earned respect sat there. Ella's eyes went wide. She looked up at Jack. Can we, Daddy? Jack wanted to say no, wanted to stay invisible, stay forgotten, but Ella's face stopped him. She was glowing, proud, seeing her father the way he used to be. Okay, Jack said softly. Okay. The general personally carried their small backpack, led them up the aisle, past all the staring faces, past the people who had judged them, past the shame and humiliation, to seats 2A and 2B, first class, wide leather seats, legroom, luxury. The general placed their bag in the overhead compartment. Then he did something that made the entire cabin gasp. He took Jack's hand, not a handshake. He held it, both hands, tight. Thank you, he whispered, for my life, for my men, for everything. Jack nodded, unable to speak. The general stepped back, saluted one more time. Then he moved to his own seat. Ella climbed into 2B, touched the leather, the screen, the buttons. Daddy, this is amazing. Jack sat down beside her. His body sank into the seat. It was more comfortable than his bed at home. But comfort wasn't what made his chest tight. It was Ella, the way she looked at him, like he was 10 feet tall, like he could do anything. Daddy, she whispered, you really are a superhero. Jack pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. I'm just a man who did his job, baby. Nothing more. But in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Pride. The flight attendant approached their seats. She was still crying. Her hands were shaking. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Sir, I am so deeply sorry. I had no idea. I should never have assumed. I should never have judged you based on. Jack held up his hand gently, stopped her. It's okay. It's not okay. Her voice cracked. Raw emotion. I was trained better than that. I was raised better than that. I'm ashamed of what I did, how I treated you, how I made your daughter feel. Jack looked at her, really looked at her. She was young, maybe 23, probably working 2 jobs to pay off student loans, just doing what she thought was right, following some unspoken rule about who belonged where. You made a mistake, Jack said quietly. We all do, every single day. What matters is what you do next, how you treat the next person, the next family. She wiped her eyes, nodded hard. I'll do better. I swear I will. I promise. She turned to leave, then stopped, reached into her pocket, pulled out 2 drink vouchers, her own personal ones. Please, anything you want. On me. Not the airline. Me. It's the least I can do. Ella smiled up at her. That innocent smile that forgave so easily. Thank you, miss. The attendant smiled back. Genuine this time. Full of gratitude. Then she walked away, wiping her eyes again. Around them, the entire cabin had transformed. The energy was different. Warm, respectful. People who had ignored them now smiled, nodded, made eye contact. A businessman across the aisle stood and approached. Gray hair, expensive suit, but his eyes were kind now. Sir, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your service, for everything you sacrificed. Then another passenger came, a woman with kind eyes. My son is in the Marines, deployed in Syria. Thank you for keeping men like him safe. An elderly man with veteran pins on his jacket shuffled over. His hand was weathered, scarred. Semper Fi, brother, you did us all proud. One by one, passengers came by, shook Jack's hand, thanked him, some with word, some with tears, some with just a solemn nod, all with respect, real respect, the kind that comes from the heart. The businessman from row 15 didn't come. He stayed in his seat, staring at the floor. His face was red, humiliated. His companion had moved away from him, sat somewhere else. Nobody wanted to sit next to shame. Nobody wanted to be associated with the man who had mocked a hero. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, approached with his mother. He was shy, nervous. He held out a small toy soldier, green plastic, well-loved. My mom says you're a real hero. Can I give you this? He's my favorite. Jack's throat tightened. He took the toy, held it carefully in his rough hands. Thank you, buddy. This means more than you know. I'll keep him safe. The boy grinned. His whole face lit up. He ran back to his mother, who mouthed thank you with tears in her eyes. Ella watched everything with wide eyes. She'd never seen people treat her father this way. With honor, with respect, with love. She'd always known he was special. But this was different. This was the world finally seeing what she had always seen. The general returned one more time. He held 2 blankets and 2 pillows. First-class quality, soft, luxury. For the flight, he said. You've earned some comfort. Then he handed Ella something else. A coin, heavy, gold, a general's challenge coin. They were rare, given only to people who had earned a general's personal respect, his personal gratitude. For you, young lady, for having the bravest dad in the sky. Ella held it like treasure, turned it over in her small hands, read the inscription. Thank you, sir. I'll keep it forever. The general smiled, a real smile, warm, fatherly. He looked at Jack. She's got your eyes, strong eyes, brave eyes. She's got her mother's heart, Jack said softly, his voice catching. That's what really matters. The general nodded. Understanding passed between them. Loss, sacrifice, the price of service, the weight of loving someone and losing them. He knew. He understood. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, squeezed once, firm, respectful. Then he returned to his seat. The plane began to taxi. The engines roared to life, power vibrating through the cabin. Soon they'd be in the air, soaring above the clouds. Ella buckled herself in, looked out the window at the tarmac, then back at her father, her hero. Daddy? Yeah, baby. I always knew you were special, but I didn't know you were this special, that you saved people, that you were so brave. Jack smiled. That same gentle smile, the one that made everything okay. You're the special one. Ella, you're the reason I came home, the reason I'm still here, the reason I wake up every morning. She hugged him, tight, the kind of hug that says more than words ever could. The kind of hug that heals old wounds. And as the plane lifted off, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The flight was smooth, quiet. Ella fell asleep against Jack's shoulder, the general's coin clutched in her small hand. Jack stared out the window, at the clouds, at the endless sky. He used to jump out of planes like this, used to see the world from 20,000 feet with a parachute and a mission. Now he just wanted to land safely, get his daughter home, make her dinner, help with homework, the simple things, the things that mattered. The general appeared one more time before landing, sat in the empty seat across the aisle. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course, sir." "Why construction? Why not stay in? You could have been anything. Instructor, consultant. Hell, you could have been a general yourself." Jack was quiet for a long moment. His hand unconsciously moved to his shirt pocket, to the dog tag hidden there. "My wife died," he said finally. "Cancer. 3 years after I retired. Ella was 6. And I realized something." He looked down at his sleeping daughter. "I'd spent my whole life saving strangers. But I couldn't save her, couldn't save the person who mattered most." His voice was steady, no self-pity, just truth. "So I decided to save what I had left. Ella, she needed a father, not a hero, not a legend, just a dad who was there. Every morning, every night." The general's eyes were wet. He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest mission of all. It's the only one that matters now." The plane descended. The landing was smooth. As they taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a true American hero on board today. Ghost Wolf, we salute you." The entire plane burst into applause. Standing ovation. Jack just waved awkwardly, uncomfortable. But Ella woke up and clapped too, beaming. When they finally deplaned, the general walked with them to the terminal. At the gate, he stopped, extended his hand. "The country may forget," he said, "but I never will." Jack shook his hand. "Thank you, sir, for everything." The general saluted one last time. Jack returned it. Then the general walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Ella slipped her hand into Jack's. "Daddy?" "Yeah, sweetheart?" "I used to think honor was about being loud, about making sure everyone knew who you were." She looked up at him. "But you taught me something today." "What's that?" "True honor is quiet. It's just doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching." Jack stopped walking, knelt down to her level, looked into her eyes, his little girl, his whole world. "I thought honor was medals and missions," he said softly. "But tonight I learned something too. True honor is a child who sees you as her hero, even in silence." He pulled her into a hug, and together, they walked home. Subscribe if you believe true heroes sit quietly among us.